Hello and welcome. You're watching NewsX with me, Devika Chopra. And today we have with us a very important voice on the broadcast, Mr. Fengsou Zhou. He was a part of the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989, and he subsequently became a survivor of the massacre and the atrocities that were meted out by the Chinese government on its own citizens. Till date, viewers, there is no official death toll for what happened in those months of 1989. And that's because the Chinese government has managed to erase it from history. And that's why, in today's context, it becomes even more important for us to put testimonies like those of Mr. Zhu's on record. Mr. Zhu, firstly, thank you so much for speaking to NewsX.
Thank you. It's my honor and a pleasure to talk about Tiananmen and China's democracy.
So, sir, like I said, I'd like to put your testimony on record. I want to know from you what happened in 1989. What exactly did the Chinese government do? What was the crackdown like?
In 1989, I was a physics student at Tsinghua University. I was excited at that moment to see millions of Chinese people went to Tiananmen Square to protest. And I was fortunate as a student organizer. Later, I was number 5 on the most wanted list of the student leaders as a mastermind of the demonstration. But in reality, I just see myself as carrying out the duty of a citizen, out of love for the country. And I believe that's true for most of the protesters. It was not a really organized event. It was like a sudden outpour of people's love for freedom. All of a sudden, we want to speak up. And it was triggered by the death of Hu Yaobang, who was the earlier leader of the Communist Party, and he was removed because he was open-minded. So that was the trigger of the event. The whole event, I think there's a lot of similarity between that and the novel, what's described in Les Miserables, the Miserables, the way it unfolded, the whole event. But the government responded with brutal killing, the use of 250,000 of the soldiers, most elite troops, to attack Beijing with tanks and machine guns. I was the last one to leave Tiananmen Square. The tanks were just like within 20 feet of me. They were driving us out from Tiananmen Square. And I saw 40 bodies of young students and Beijing citizens killed, raped, in white clothes in a hospital, in the outside of the hospital, in a bicycle shed. So, because the hospital was so overwhelmed with the people who were wounded and died, they just had to put these people on the ground there. That was just so shocking to me, even given what we know about the brutality of communist China. To me, that was a moment for my true journey, as a freedom fighter for China. I had to speak out for these people who died. Now, as you said earlier, the Chinese government has been trying to erase the memory, and in China, they seem to have succeed already. Most people don't know what happened 31 years ago. Many of the families who died probably had disappeared without ever being known by outside world. There's just a lot of heartbreaking stories. Now, my organization, Humanitarian China, we work closely with the victims of the Tiananmen massacre. So one group is called the Tiananmen Mothers. Every year we work with them. We hear what this group was formed by the most brave ones of the family, because most of the families are so afraid they wouldn't even want to talk about it. So only a small minority of these families, they formed a group called the Tiananmen Mothers. And among this group, there are, I think, about a dozen already committed suicide because, so it's so depressing. They couldn't see a hope for vindication of their family within the communist China. So because 31 years is a long time, these people are becoming old. Many of them died. So for us, it's a privilege to be able to speak, to talk about this freely. I mean, today, I really I'm thankful that you give me this opportunity to talk to Indian public about this.
Absolutely, Mrs. Yu. I mean, I feel sorry that we're having to ask you to recount what had happened back then, because it would have been so traumatic. But unfortunately, this is just something that all of us have to come together and do. On that note, I also have to ask you, it's been, like you said, 31 years. How much has the situation today worsened in China with regards to freedom of speech and expression? What happens to a person today when they speak out against the Xi Jinping government?
Yeah, the Tiananmen massacre is a pivotal moment in China's history. China could have taken on a different path then, but they have gone on the wrong path. Since then, the repression on human rights has become worse day by day. And I think there are two reasons. First, this regime that's so brutal, it kills own people, survived. And they believe that the international community don't really care about what happened to China. Secondly, domestically, they believe such kind of brutal repression works. That's why they have been using this against Chinese people ever since. We don't really see such a large-scale protest anymore. But for example, in forced demolition, every year, there are people who died because you wouldn't give up your property. They would just use demolish, use machine to crush the property with people inside. This happens like every year. But to the outside and to Chinese, most people don't really see this. We don't really know. It's not talked about. All you see, it's the prosperity of China. We don't really see the bloodshed anymore. And most people, they learned the wrong lesson because in this brutal massacre, they learned to shut up and be quiet, be a servile, citizen to the government, obedient. That's what you see. So that's the other side of it. It's really getting worse since then.
So, Mrs. Yu, before I move on to India and the world community and their silence, I just want to understand from you as well, how does the Xi Jinping government then indoctrinate people, specifically in mainland China? We know of what's been happening in Tibet and Xinjiang, but we don't know enough about mainland China and what really happens there. How is this fear instilled in the people?
What they have achieved is beyond any wildest imagination in history. Most people talk about 1984, the novel, the fiction, but this is a lot worse than fiction in people's thoughts, monitored, live. They can track anyone at any moment with everything. So everybody is transparent. This kind of control, I think most people just don't really know. For example, there are some journalists who tested, how long it takes for the system to locate you. It just takes like minutes to track someone. And so far, for example, for censorship, they have used the most sophisticated technology, some of the most advanced technology of artificial intelligence, big data, are used on monitoring, surveillancing people, and preventing them from expressing themselves. So there's like even people who talk about, the food is bad at this food hall, and they would be arrested because this is not the news they want to see. And for the world, I think the most alarming is this pandemic. For example, the doctor who posted about it in end of last year, he was censored and later died in February. And most people probably have forgotten about him. Had he been allowed to speak out, had there been free press, the world could avoid this disaster simply because he was talking about this man-to-man, person-to-person transmission through this virus, the pandemic. This was end of end of last year. And
right.
Yeah, so because of this so most people, we couldn't know what really happened, even if it's happening next door. So what people see every day is a happy reality that's doctored for them, produced, and sometimes customized to very individual, because they can do this, they can feed you whatever you want. They can predict what you want to know, to hear, and produce it for you. This is just beyond any imagination. And for the most sophisticated technology, if they're using it there. For example, when the Nobel Peace Laureate Liu Xiaobo died in prison 3 years ago, just remember how significant this was. He was the second one to die in prison as a Nobel Peace Laureate. The first one was in Hitler's Nazi Germany. You can think of the parallel here. But of course, nobody really cared about his death. Even United States didn't protest strongly. At that time, when I was trying to post pictures of Liu Xiaobo stand through WeChat, and like within minutes, when the picture showed up, it was censored, deleted. And then some people tried to send other pictures, they all deleted. This, I think, so far is the first time, probably only time, that the artificial intelligence was smart enough to detect the image of a person, no matter how different they, because, for example, I'm old today. I have pictures earlier, I have different settings. You cannot just delete, but in China, this is possible. They did this to Liu Xiaobo. Any picture containing Liu Xiaobo and his wife was censored. You couldn't see it. And this was done automatically, like within minutes. They just believe the way they could produce reality, prevent people from knowing the truth. That's what's happening to China every day now. For example, we have a good friend who we support in China. His name is Lu Yu. All he did was to collect the protests in China every day. So he is collecting the published information. These are supposedly already censored. So these just pop up sometime. And when he saw it, he knew this kind of news would be deleted soon.
Right.
So he would download it. That's all he did. And he collected information. From his data, we know that, for example, there were just hundreds, thousands of protests, like in a month, all over China. But of course, after a while, we don't really know because they will all be deleted. All you see is all these happy faces. And he was arrested and sentenced to 4 years in prison simply for collecting this information, just trying to know the truth. That's the kind of price people have to pay. Of course, for most people, they learn to self-censor as a result.
And this is absolutely, it's terrifying, Mr. Zhu, what all you're telling us, because like I said, we don't know the extent. We know a little bit, but we don't know the actual extent of what's happening. But on that note, I also want to ask you, you said recently that you feel that the world needs to follow India and take India's lead follow India's lead in countering China. What are your suggestions? What do you think India can do?
I have been calling for banning the Chinese apps for a long time. These apps like WeChat. I think India is the first country to do it wholesale. This is a great move. What's important is that we have to know in China, there's no individual company, there's no individual person. Everything, every entity, every soul is a tool, instrument of the government. So you cannot treat this as a commercial product. They are all hidden, secret, just instruments for the government, to monitor, to surveillance, to gather information. So to use it, for example, in India, will endanger everyone. That's definitely true. The way, as I described, they can gather data, they can just follow people's every step. It's scary what they can do. It is true that this is not only for India, for everyone in the world. They are trying to gather information. They are building an archive for every person in the world, China now, with all the published information. That's why I always believe we should cut off this connection of these long arms of China with external world. I believe on this, India is doing great, but there's a lot more. For example, on technology front, China is investing a lot in the technology companies in India. This will be a big issue. I think this should be next step. It should be investigated, look at, scrutinized very closely. As I said, there's no private entity in China that make everybody, every company from China, an agent of this Communist Party.
Of the Chinese stuff.
Different, yeah. So that's why we need to fight. For India, also, I have great expectation because it's the most populous democracy in the world. Yeah. The Chinese government brainwash Chinese in a way. They say, oh, okay, why we don't have democracy? Because we have so many people, they see people as a burden, as slaves. But India is proof that democracy could thrive in a big country with over 1 billion people and very diverse backgrounds. So I always wish the best for India, and I believe there's a lot of advantages for India, with a well-educated population, and that's a great competitor to communist China on many ways, and it could be a great partner with the United States on many fronts.
Absolutely. And Mrs. Yu, I also want to understand your perspective on what's happening, between India and China at the border, from the idea that is this perception of China being invincible, untouchable, somewhere breaking down? Do you think that these could be the building blocks for the fall of the CCP government?
I hope so, but I don't really know. I think the situation is very complicated, and Xi's ambition is global dominance. There's no doubt about it, and he will not be stopped just by a small setback. So we have to prepare for a long fight from all different directions: South China Sea, Japan, Taiwan, and the Hong Kong situation, and on every front need to fight back. So
what you're basically saying is that if there is, let's say, a 7-front war against China, then there's a possibility that the Xi Jinping government somewhere is going to succumb to that pressure, buckle down under the pressure and break. Is that what you feel?
Yes, definitely. So I believe the democracies of the world should unite against this totalitarian China. That's very important to fight for this common value of democracy.
And Mr. Zhu, I also want to understand from you now, there are protests that are brewing in several parts of China. We know that there have been protests in Tibet for over 5 decades now, but in several other parts, you can see it in Hong Kong, in Inner Mongolia. Then, of course, there are tensions with Taiwan. Xinjiang is, becoming another headache for the CCP government. I want to understand from you, how is it that India and the world community can now step in to strengthen these movements?
I think this is a good step, like this kind of civil society exchange. Through your interview of me, Indian public can know more about the freedom fighting Chinese, the resistance in China. My organization, Humanitarian China, we work with the resistance in China for a long time. Every year, we give more than 100 cases of individual support to these political prisoners in China. But the numbers are increasing every year now. You see there are widespread, persistent resistance from all directions, from the tradition, political activists, also from feminists, from labor activists, from Christian churches. The house churches in China, they are a great force now. For example, the most famous one is this pastor Wang Yi of Early Rain Church in Chengdu. He was sentenced to 9 years in prison for subverting the government. Think about it. He's a pastor. What he really did was he openly condemned Xi Jinping. He openly condemned Xi Jinping, and that's as a preacher. That's his job. So he was arrested. Now, even his wife, his son, they are under house arrest every day. But still, people are trying to join this church in Chengdu, because they see a hope, a different way of life that's different from the way communist China is running. So there are hopes in China, that from working together, we can strengthen this resistance. For example, what's going on now, even in Hong Kong, South in Hong Kong, people are still trying to protest. Like this weekend, many were arrested. A 12-year-old young girl was arrested. This just shows how fearful the communist China is towards its own people. Every year, they use more money defending the regime against its own people than external enemies. Think about the legitimacy of this government. It's a lie. And right. As you talk about, for now, there is a very widespread protest in South Mongolia. People are trying to protect their rights of speaking their native language.
So, Mrs. Zhu, I also want to understand from you now, in 1989, you took a big step as a young student and you tried to stand up for what's right. We see that several young people are now protesting in Tibet, in Hong Kong, in Inner Mongolia, as you pointed out. Your quick message to them, sir.
I see great hope in these people. I definitely see, like myself, 31 years ago, they are young, hopeful, idealistic. And it's a long fight. We are facing a monster, but this is one of the greatest fights in human history, to overthrow such a government that's brutalized 1.4 billion people. And this is to move against such brutal force, to democratize China, to win our own rights, God-given rights. This is a great work. It's one of the most honorable challenge for anyone.
And before we wrap up, sir, a couple of quick questions from you. I want to ask you, since we see that there is now a clear momentum that's building against the CCP government, against Xi Jinping in the world over, we've touched upon how the world community has been silent, but they're not so silent anymore. How crucial do you think, Mr. Zhu, it is for us to continue building onto this momentum if we truly want, the Chinese totalitarian and authoritarianism to finally come to an end someday?
That's a great question. This, for us, this is just a beginning. There's a lot we need to do to work together. So, for China, to be a force of prosperity and peace, China has to be democratized, and we have to work persistently and carefully with each other. I think now there's a great momentum, especially from United States, from Taiwan, from India. I think more countries should join, especially Europe should join. Nobody can be in the middle in this fight. This is like the fight against Nazi Germany in last century.
Absolutely. And Mr. Zhu, it's been an eye-opening conversation for me, and I hope that anybody watching this will actually learn something from what you've told us, and maybe just begin searching up themselves and educate themselves. But before we wrap this up, one last question from you, sir, since you've drawn a parallel with Nazi Germany. The Nazis were tried for the Holocaust and the war crimes that they committed. Are you somewhere hopeful that one day, perhaps in the next decade itself, there will be similar trials for CCP officials and people like Xi Jinping, and that they will be finally brought to justice for what they've done?
Definitely. I believe justice will eventually be done, and they will all be held for what they have committed. The heinous crime against people, against humanity. But so for us, the most important thing we can do outside is try to document what happened, to expose their crime. That's why we are building a museum of Tiananmen in Liberty Sculpture Park. So we for now, because Chinese government is trying so hard to erase the memory. So we need to keep record of what happened, like the 40 million people who died during the man-made famine in the 1960s, and the unknown number of people died during Tiananmen massacre. And now that we try to keep these people's life, their memory alive. That's part of the future, for the future judgment against these criminals of communist China. We have to work hard to keep record, to keep the truth.
Absolutely, Mr. Zhu. Thank you so much. Like I said, it's been an eye-opening conversation. Thank you so much for taking our time to speak to NewsX and through us to a larger Indian audience who hopefully will now be intrigued enough to at least look into the atrocities that are being committed by the Chinese government against their own citizens. Thank you so much, Mr. Zhu.
Thank you for having me. It's always my honor and a pleasure, and I hope I can visit India in person someday to talk to more people about this, and we can work together.
Absolutely, sir. Thank you so much for joining us on NewsX.
Thank you.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.